Under the relentless sun of a Texas summer, the land seemed to breathe with secrets too heavy to speak. The air shimmered, the riverbanks whispered with danger, and yet, amid the silence of prairie winds, a woman's heart carried both grief and a strange kind of quiet courage. Abigail's story did not begin with laughter or sweetness. It began with loss, with the earth itself claiming those she had once called her own. A husband laid to rest too early, 2 infants taken by fever before their lives had truly opened. She remained, alone but unbroken, her spirit refusing to surrender to sorrow. Her solitude became both her prison and her sanctuary, and each dawn she rose with the same determined rhythm, tending to the soil, the animals, and the fragile threads of hope she refused to let unravel. Her small cabin overlooked the winding Brazos River, a stream both gentle and treacherous. She often watched its surface shimmer like glass, hiding currents beneath that could sweep away the strongest soul. It was here she built her days, and it was here the unexpected began to unfold. The villagers in Cedar Creek whispered of her stubbornness, of how a woman should not dwell alone on land shadowed by Comanche trails. But in the solitude, Abigail found not weakness, but healing. She planted beans and corn as if each seed was a prayer for life. She learned the rifle as if it were a hymn of protection. She listened to the songs of meadowlarks as if they were lullabies meant for a child she no longer held. And in this rhythm of survival, the threads of destiny began to weave. What no one in Cedar Creek understood was the quiet fire in her chest. Beneath her grief lay a heart still beating with yearning, not merely for survival, but for something warmer, something gentler than the wilderness could ever offer. It is in this fragile longing that love first finds its soil, though disguised in the most dangerous of ways. For love often comes not in the shape of a neighbor's smile or a stranger's courtesy, but in the shocking instant when 2 worlds collide, when danger and compassion intertwine so tightly one cannot separate them. The land itself conspired to bring her toward that moment. The river, with its hidden pools of quicksand, its deceptive beauty, its promise of death and renewal, would be the stage upon which her heart was tested. She went there with only a woven basket, a knife, and her own thoughts for company. Yet fate had already chosen to place another soul upon her path. A rider, painted in colors of war, feathers dancing in the wind, appeared at the far bank. A young warrior, not yet hardened fully by battle, his movements sharp with urgency, his presence both terrifying and strangely magnetic. He belonged to the world settlers feared and cursed in hushed tones. Yet in the moment his pony bolted and he plunged into the hungry earth, sinking into the river's treacherous grip. He was not an enemy. He was simply a boy on the edge of death. Abigail's breath caught as she watched the scene unfold. Instinct screamed at her to turn away, to let the river do what so many believed it was meant to do. Claim him, erase the danger, cleanse the land of one more threat. But compassion moves faster than logic, and love often begins in those quiet acts of defiance against fear. She could not allow him to vanish beneath the mud. In his eyes, dark, desperate, pleading, she saw not the face of a foe, but the reflection of every soul she had already lost. And in that instant, her grief became her courage. What happened next would alter the course of 2 lives, binding them together in a way neither could have foreseen. she fashioned a rope from branches, her hands bleeding as she tied them with strips of her apron. She called to him, her voice steady, carrying across the river as though guided by unseen hands. He reached, he grasped, and she pulled with all the strength left in her bones. And when that was not enough, she turned to his own pony, whispering softly until the animal obeyed. With one last desperate effort, the boy was drawn free, collapsing upon the bank like a soul reborn. Their eyes met, hers wide with shock, his filled with a gratitude that spoke louder than words. It was here, in that charged silence by the river, that the story of Abigail and Takakota began, not with tender confessions or stolen glances, but with mud, breathless hearts, and the unbreakable bond of life saved by another's hands. The turquoise talisman he would later give her glimmered like a promise. But already, before tokens and words, there was a thread pulling them closer. A thread woven not by chance, but by something greater, something that heals even the deepest wounds. And so the frontier, once only a place of danger, became the stage for a love that neither bullets nor prejudice could erase. What was once solitude would become connection. What was once fear would blossom into tenderness. And the lonely widow who thought her heart buried beneath sorrow would find it beating again, faster than the drums of war, stronger than the silence of grief. If you feel the warmth in this story, if it soothes a part of your own loneliness, I invite you to walk further with me. Leave a thought below, share your voice in the comments, and let your heart rest in the healing of stories. Subscribe and stay close, for love has many more turns to take, and the next chapter will open wider than you imagine. From the riverbank, where quicksand nearly claimed a young life, the journey of hearts begins to flow into something larger than either could have dreamed, and that flow carries us gently into the next chapter of their tale. The turquoise bear rested against her chest like a secret heartbeat, its weight a constant reminder of the moment when life and death brushed so close together. Abigail had not expected him to return, not the boy she saved, not the eyes that had pierced her loneliness with a look both fierce and vulnerable. Yet even as she worked in her garden, even as she hung laundry on the line or milked the restless cow, her fingers strayed unconsciously to the pendant. It was as though the stone pulsed with its own quiet rhythm, soothing her spirit, healing places inside her that had long been left in shadow. The nights stretched quiet, but the silence no longer cut so deep. Somewhere beyond the tree line she knew he lived, breathing under the same stars, carrying the same memory. 3 days after the rescue, dawn broke with an unnatural hush. The cicadas failed to sing, the air thickened as if holding its breath, and Abigail felt her chest tighten with a premonition she could not name. Her hands moved through the morning rituals, feeding the chickens, drawing water, weeding the beans, but each sound rang hollow, each gesture accompanied by a restless awareness that something vast was approaching. The healing comfort of routine could not quiet the storm rising in her veins. And then, as if the earth itself confirmed her fears, the faint thunder of hooves began to roll across the horizon. At first, she thought it only her imagination, the whisper of distant storms playing tricks with her senses. But the sound grew, steady and unrelenting, until the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. She rushed inside, seized the rifle from its resting place, and peered through the cabin's small window. A cloud of dust swelled above the ridgeline, sunlight catching on feathers and painted shields. 60 riders swept into view like a living wave of fire and breath. Her pulse faltered. Not one lone boy, not a chance encounter by the river. An entire world had arrived at her doorstep. At their head rode a man whose very presence commanded silence. Silver threaded through his dark hair, and his stallion carried the weight of his authority, as though horse and rider were carved from the same spirit. Eagle feathers crowned his war bonnet, each a testament of victories past, each a reminder of what power meant in this land. But what struck Abigail most was the familiarity in his gaze, the same unyielding strength she had glimpsed in the boy she had rescued. Takakota's father she knew at once. The chief himself, come not as a shadow, but as storm made flesh. The war party halted within sight of her homestead, dust swirling around their painted bodies. Spears caught the light, bows strung tight, yet the silence that followed was heavier than battle cries. She gripped her rifle with trembling hands, though she knew it was useless against so many. But before fear could unravel her, a single voice rose from the line of warriors. Familiar, urgent, steady. Takakota. She could not see him at first, hidden among the painted riders, but she knew the timbre of his voice. He spoke her name, and the sound carried through the still morning like a thread binding her heart to his. When at last he dismounted and stepped forward beside the chief, Abigail's breath faltered. He was transformed from the boy sinking in mud to a figure cloaked in war paint and dignity, his bearing proud, his eyes unflinching. Yet beneath the markings, she still saw the one she had saved, the boy who had reached for her rope, who had looked at her not with hatred, but with gratitude. Now he stood as bridge between them, his every word a delicate weave of translation, his every glance an unspoken reminder of their bond. Chief Iron Bear's gaze fixed on her cabin, on the garden tilled by her hands, on the woman who had dared to rescue his son. He spoke in cadences rich and deep, words Abigail could not understand, but the weight of them pressed against her chest. Takakota translated with solemn care. His father asked why she had risked her life for an enemy. Abigail's answer came without hesitation, her voice steady though her heart trembled. Because I saw not an enemy drowning, but a young man who deserved to live. Takakota's lips shaped her words into his own tongue, carrying them across the divide like a prayer offered into the wind. For a moment, silence reigned. Then the chief's stern expression softened, just enough to reveal something beyond suspicion. Recognition. He named her Saves the Drowning, and the warriors lifted their voices in a cry that rolled like thunder across the prairie. In that instant, Abigail was no longer merely a widow clinging to survival. She had become something else, anointed by strangers, bound to them by a life debt older than treaties or blood feuds. The weight of this revelation pressed heavily upon her shoulders, yet within it stirred a gentle warmth. The chief offered her sanctuary, a place within their protection, a choice to walk between worlds. Takakota stood beside him, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of pride and longing, though words could not capture the fullness of what passed between them. She touched the turquoise bear at her chest, and for the first time in years she felt her heart not merely endure, but awaken. That night, as the Comanche guards encircled her cabin in silent vigil, Abigail sat beneath the starlight, listening to Takakota's stories. He spoke of his people's songs, of rivers that healed, of horses that carried more than men, but the spirit of freedom itself. His voice was gentle, weaving warmth into the night, each word a salve against the wounds of her solitude. Between them stretched the chasm of language and custom, yet the quiet glances, the smiles that lingered, the pauses that filled with breath instead of fear, all these became a new language of their own, a language of beginnings. The frontier that had once been only a wilderness of sorrow was shifting into something luminous, fragile, yet alive with promise. Abigail felt it in the rhythm of the drums that echoed faintly from the Comanche camp. She felt it in the silver armband the chief had pressed into her hand, a gift of peace and burden alike. And she felt it most keenly when Takakota, pausing in his stories, let silence speak louder than any word. Their eyes held, and in that stillness she discovered the tender truth. Healing often enters quietly, disguised as gratitude, until it blossoms into love. The dawn would bring choices heavier than any she had faced. Yet as night folded softly into morning, she knew the path ahead was no longer hers alone. It belonged also to the boy she had saved, the man he was becoming, and the love that now pulsed quietly between them, waiting to rise like the sun itself. And with that, the story moved gently into the next turn of fate, where love would be tested by shadows deeper than either of them yet understood. The morning unfolded with a solemn beauty, the kind that lingers like a hymn whispered over the land. The grass glistened with dew, the river shimmered in muted gold, and Abigail felt as though the earth itself held its breath, waiting for her decision. She stood on her porch, hands resting on the silver armband the chief had placed upon her, its turquoise stones catching the light as if carrying a hidden fire. Around her cabin, Comanche guards moved in quiet rhythm, their watchful presence both strange and reassuring. No longer was she a widow hidden in solitude. She was Saves the Drowning, a name carried in the voices of warriors, a bridge between two worlds. Yet the weight of this honor pressed heavily on her chest. Takakota came to her with the dawn, his footsteps soft on the earth. His presence seemed to still the morning, as though even the wind bent to listen when he approached. He brought her a bowl of stew and a look of quiet understanding, his eyes holding a warmth that cut through her uncertainty. They sat together, speaking in fragments of English and gestures, his words halting but sincere. He told her of his father's trust, of the sacredness of a life debt, of the hope his people placed upon her choice. And though his voice carried duty, beneath it was something softer, unspoken yet unmistakable, the tenderness of a bond neither could deny. She studied him as he spoke, the line of his jaw, the strength in his shoulders, the shadows in his eyes that revealed he bore responsibilities beyond his years. He was no longer the boy she had pulled from the quicksand. He stood before her as heir, as son of a great chief, as a man whose path was bound to his people. Yet, when his gaze lingered on her, it was not as a chief's son regarding an ally. It was as a soul recognizing another soul in the vast loneliness of the world. And in that recognition, Abigail felt her heart tremble with something dangerously close to longing. Through the long hours of that day, Takakota remained near. He showed her the intricate beadwork on his garments, explained their meaning with careful words and patient hands. He taught her signs in the language of his people, gestures as fluid as river water, so that even in silence they could speak. She laughed once, the sound startling her when he mispronounced her name in English but smiled triumphantly at the attempt. That laugh, light and healing, felt like sunlight breaking into a place that had been too long in shadow. She had forgotten what it was to feel seen, to feel warmth ripple through her chest like a song that belonged to her alone. As dusk came, Chief Iron Bear returned with his council, the air thick with gravity. Abigail stepped forward, her hands steady though her heart raced. She had spent the day searching herself, listening not only to the wisdom Takakota had shared, but to the rhythm of her own soul. She could not abandon her homestead, nor betray the memory of her husband and children buried beneath its soil. But neither could she ignore the bond forming between her and the Comanche, a bond that had already altered her spirit. And so she spoke, voice clear against the hush of evening, declaring her intent to remain as a bridge, to hold her land under Comanche protection, and to serve as a voice for peace between their people. The decision rippled through the gathered warriors like wind through tall grass, some approving, some doubtful, some suspicious. But the chief listened with measured eyes, his silence heavy with judgment. At last he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years and battles, acknowledging her courage and accepting her choice. He named her family, granted her sanctuary, and declared her land sacred ground. The warriors lifted their voices in a cry that stirred Abigail's blood, yet it was the glance from Takakota that anchored her heart. Pride, relief, and something deeper shone in his gaze, a promise not spoken, but felt as surely as the pendant against her skin. That night, as fires flickered in the Comanche camp and shadows danced against her cabin walls, Abigail found herself restless. She stepped into the night air, the stars wheeling in brilliance above, and found Takakota waiting at the edge of her garden. He said little, only that tomorrow would bring new challenges, that some among his people doubted her, that her strength would be tested. She nodded, understanding more from the tone of his voice than the words themselves. Then, in a silence more intimate than speech, they stood side by side, their shoulders nearly touching, gazing at the heavens as though seeking the same answer in the constellations. In that closeness, the barrier of language dissolved. She felt the steady warmth of his presence, the gentleness beneath his warrior's bearing, and the quiet healing he carried into her grief. He, in turn, seemed to sense the resilience in her, the compassion that had driven her into the river to save him. Their breaths mingled in the cool night air, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the world beyond them ceased to exist. Two souls, scarred by loss and divided by culture, found a fragile sanctuary in each other's nearness. The night deepened, yet neither moved to leave. It was not yet love, but it was the first fragile shape of it, the recognition of kindred spirits who might, against all reason, carry each other's burdens. The turquoise pendant glowed faintly in the starlight, and the silver armband pressed cool against her skin, each token a reminder of promises made and promises yet to be fulfilled. The healing had begun, soft and tender, like the first stirring of spring after a long winter. When dawn came again, it would bring not only choices, but trials. Shadows of mistrust still lingered, and danger brewed beyond the horizon. Yet, as Abigail stood with Takakota beneath the stars, her heart whispered that love had already taken root. Fragile, hidden, but alive, and it would carry her forward into the next chapter of their story, where longing and destiny would meet with even greater force. The day broke with a sky of pale rose and silver, the kind of dawn that seemed to promise both beauty and danger in equal measure. Abigail rose early, though she had not slept deeply. The weight of her new role pressed against her chest as tangibly as the turquoise pendant resting on her skin. Her hands moved through her morning chores with habitual grace. Yet her mind was restless, circling around the knowledge that she was no longer only a widow surviving in solitude. She had become something else entirely, something she had never sought but could no longer refuse. A symbol to two worlds that had never known peace. Takakota remained near, his presence steady as the river's flow. He joined her in silence at first, helping gather water, feeding the chickens with motions that seemed oddly tender for a warrior who carried the bearing of battle in every step. She watched the way his hands gentled the restless animals, the way he stood tall but never proud, the way his gaze softened when it found her. Each small act revealed layers she had not expected, discipline tempered by kindness, strength balanced with warmth. And in those layers, Abigail felt her heart stir, recognizing something healing in his nearness, something she had longed for without ever daring to name. The Comanche guards, watchful but respectful, had woven themselves into the rhythm of her land. Their presence was a strange comfort, though she could feel the tension that hummed beneath their discipline. She was not blind to the suspicion some held toward her, nor to the danger of her precarious position. Yet Takakota seemed determined to shield her, not only with his body, but with his patience, translating questions, explaining customs, easing the sharp edges of misunderstanding. His voice, though marked by the cadence of another tongue, became a bridge that softened every exchange. Abigail found herself leaning into that bridge, trusting it, trusting him. As the sun climbed higher, Chief Iron Bear returned with a smaller retinue, his expression grave, his words deliberate. Takakota translated carefully, telling her of the decision she must make, whether to remain under Comanche protection or to walk fully into their world and live among them. Abigail felt the earth sway beneath her feet at the enormity of it. To leave behind her cabin, the soil where her husband and children lay, seemed unthinkable. Yet to remain alone, marked as both insider and outsider, carried its own peril. She lifted her chin, met the chief's eyes, and spoke with clarity. She would stay on her land as a bridge between their people, a place of sanctuary where two worlds might meet. The council murmured, some approving, others doubtful. Iron Bear studied her with the weight of a man who had seen too much betrayal, yet beneath his stern gaze lay a glimmer of respect. He named her family, declared her cabin sacred ground, and promised her the shield of his warriors. Then he offered her an armband of silver and turquoise, ancient and precious, a relic that bound her to his people's memory. Abigail accepted with trembling hands, understanding the depth of the trust being placed in her. That night, as the firelight from the Comanche camp flickered across the prairie, Abigail sat on her porch with Takakota at her side. He spoke of his people, of their songs and traditions, of battles fought and wounds carried. His words painted not savagery, but humanity, not an enemy, but a people whose lives were rooted in earth and spirit. Abigail listened, her heart widening with every story, her grief loosening as though soothed by the cadence of his voice. she found herself speaking in return of her husband, of her children, of the silence that had once threatened to devour her. He listened with the same reverence she had given him, his eyes holding her sorrow as though it were a sacred trust. In that sharing, something gentle and undeniable bloomed, fragile yet strong as a wildflower pushing through stone. The days that followed wove them closer. He taught her words in Comanche, laughing softly when her tongue stumbled, his laughter like sunlight spilling into her solitude. She showed him how to tend the garden, how to mend a fence, how to make bread from cornmeal and patience. They moved together through tasks both ordinary and sacred, discovering a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The suspicion of others remained, but in their private moments, when their hands brushed by accident or their eyes lingered too long, the world's divisions fell away. In those fleeting instants, there was no frontier, no war, no boundaries, only two souls finding shelter in one another. Yet beneath the sweetness, shadows gathered. Rumors whispered of settlers pressing deeper into Comanche lands, of warriors restless for retaliation. Abigail felt the tremors of coming conflict in the tension of the guards, in the heaviness of Takakota's silences when news reached him. She knew her choice had not only altered her life, but had set her on a path that could not escape danger. Still, when she looked at him, at the boy she had saved, the man whose presence now steadied her, she felt a healing she had thought impossible, and that healing gave her courage to face whatever storm awaited. One evening, as twilight draped the land in shades of violet and silver, Takakota stood with her at the riverbank where their story had begun. He pointed to the water, then to the stars, and spoke softly in halting English, "River carries many things. Stars guide the way. You and me, same." His words were simple, yet they struck her heart with a force greater than any poetry. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his, and in that touch the silence of years lifted. It was not yet a declaration, but it was a promise. The turquoise pendant pressed warmly against her chest, as though echoing the truth she already knew. Love had entered quietly, disguised as gratitude and duty, but it had taken root. And though the winds of danger whispered from the horizon, Abigail felt certain that this bond, fragile, healing, unshakable, would carry them into the next turn of fate, where love and loyalty would be tested by fire. The night embraced them with its vast starlit canopy, and with it came the certainty that their paths, once separate, were now bound together. And as the river murmured at their feet, carrying reflections of the heavens, Abigail understood that the story was only beginning, and the next chapter would demand even more of her heart. The stillness of the prairie before dawn carried a weight that pressed upon Abigail's spirit like an unseen hand. The night had been long, restless with dreams of shifting sands and voices calling her name from both sides of a chasm she could not cross. When she stepped outside, the horizon burned faintly with the first light, a thin silver edge against the vastness of the land. Around her cabin, the Comanche guards kept silent watch, their figures dark and steady, as though carved from the very earth. It struck her how much had changed. Where once she had lived in fear of raiding shadows, now those shadows stood as her protectors. And still, beneath the fragile peace, tension brewed like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Takakota appeared from the camp, his stride calm, his eyes carrying both warmth and gravity. He greeted her not with words, but with the quiet offering of presence, and she felt her heart ease, as though his nearness carried its own healing balm. Together they walked to the river's edge, where the water shimmered with the pale glow of morning. The place where their lives had first intertwined seemed different now, charged with meaning. She could not look at the shifting currents without remembering the desperate struggle, the rope of branches, his eyes locking on hers in that moment between life and death. That memory pulsed in the turquoise bear at her chest, reminding her that fate had woven them together in threads too strong to be undone. When Chief Iron Bear arrived later that morning with his council of elders, the air itself seemed to tighten. The chief's bearing was solemn, his silvered hair flowing like threads of wisdom, his eyes sharp with the knowledge of blood and battle. Abigail stood before him, her hands folded against the armband he had given her, her heart steady, though her body trembled. She understood that this moment would carry her beyond the safety of her cabin. It would mark her not merely as a protected widow, but as something larger, something neither side could ignore. The chief spoke at length, his voice rich and unyielding, and Takakota translated with careful precision. Her life, he explained, was no longer her own. By saving the heir of the tribe, she had bound herself to them. By choosing to remain on her land, she had declared herself a bridge, and with that came obligations that would test the strength of her spirit. Abigail listened, her chest tightening with each word. She had been asked to be an intermediary, to carry messages between worlds, to stand in places where mistrust was thick and violence close at hand. The danger was plain, yet she felt no urge to shrink away. Instead, she lifted her chin and spoke with quiet resolve. If her compassion at the river had planted even the smallest seed of peace, then she would tend it with all her strength, no matter the cost. The chief's eyes softened with something like respect, though his words carried warning. The path she had chosen was lined with enemies, some wearing white faces, some painted in war colors. Both would resent her, both would seek to undo what she tried to build. Yet, if she endured, she might hold back the flood of blood for at least a season, and that was no small thing. As the council dispersed, Takakota lingered. He did not speak of duty then, nor of the dangers looming, but of his own heart. With halting words, he told her she carried strength he had never seen in a woman of her people. He told her that when he had sunk into the river's death, it was her voice that had pulled him back more than any rope. His gaze lingered on hers, steady and searching, as though he sought permission to speak what remained unspoken. Abigail felt warmth rise in her chest, the healing warmth of being seen not as symbol or savior, but as woman, as soul. She did not need his words. She read them in the softness of his eyes, in the way his hand brushed against hers like a question. And though neither declared it, both knew love had already taken root, fragile and fierce all at once. The days that followed pressed them into deeper closeness. Together they tended her small garden, Takakota crouching with unaccustomed patience to tie bean shoots, his laughter breaking when she teased his clumsy hands. She taught him the names of herbs in English, and he answered with their names in Comanche, their voices weaving a gentle rhythm of exchange. At night they sat near the firelight, sharing fragments of stories, hers shaped by sorrow, his by tradition. Each tale became a bridge, each silence between words a sanctuary. Slowly, grief loosened its grip on Abigail. The memories of her husband and children no longer weighed solely as wounds, but became part of the soil from which new life might grow. Takakota's presence was not a replacement for what she had lost, but a healing light that allowed her to remember with tenderness instead of despair. but beyond their fragile cocoon, unrest gathered. Settlers were moving closer, driven by hunger for land and the promises of government that disregarded old treaties. Rumors spoke of a town called Harmony Falls, rising where Comanche winter camps had always lain. Warriors muttered of betrayal, young men's tempers burned for retribution. Chief Iron Bear looked to Abigail now with expectation, sending her heart into a storm of conflict. She was to carry words of peace into a place brimming with mistrust, to face her own people and beg them to see the humanity of those they called enemies. The task was nearly unbearable in its weight. On the eve before her journey, Takakota came to her cabin, his face lit only by firelight. He brought her a cloak of soft deerskin embroidered with patterns of turquoise and bone. He told her it had been his mother's, a garment of honor and protection. When he placed it gently over her shoulders, Abigail felt not only the warmth of the material, but the tenderness of his touch, the quiet promise that wherever she walked, a part of him would walk with her. Her breath caught as she met his gaze, the silence between them thick with longing and restraint. She wanted to reach for him, to close the fragile space that still held them apart, but she did not. Some things were too sacred to rush, and this bond was one of them. Instead, she touched his hand lightly, a gesture both simple and infinite, and in that touch lay everything neither dared yet to speak. The morning came with a crimson sky, the kind sailors once called warning. Abigail mounted the Comanche mare the chief had gifted her, Wind Dancer, its dark eyes bright and alert. At her side rode Takakota, steady as a shadow, his presence a shield stronger than steel. Behind them, 2 other warriors followed at a distance, silent protectors hidden from sight. The land stretched vast before them, rolling hills painted with wild flowers and sorrow, every mile carrying them closer to the conflict waiting at Harmony Falls. As the sun rose high, Abigail's heart steadied. The turquoise pendant pressed against her skin, the silver armband gleamed in the light, and the cloak of Takakota's mother lay warm across her shoulders. She carried with her not only symbols, but the weight of love beginning to bloom, fragile yet healing, fierce enough to face even the storms of men. And as the settlement's smoke came into view, rising in dark coils against the endless sky, she knew the time had come to step fully into the role fate had chosen for her. The bridge between worlds would be tested, and so too would the love that had begun quietly beside the river, a love that promised to heal but might also be torn apart by the fires of mistrust. With the horizon trembling before her and Takakota's presence steady at her side, Abigail pressed forward into the unknown, carrying in her chest both fear and a love too precious to let go. The road ahead shimmered with danger, but also with the faint, fragile light of hope, the kind of light that could only grow when hearts dared to believe in something greater than themselves. And so their story moved into the next chapter, where peace and passion would collide, and every choice would shape not only their lives, but the destiny of 2 peoples bound by fate. The road to Harmony Falls stretched across a landscape both haunting and beautiful, a land scarred by countless conflicts, yet still capable of offering breathtaking grace. Abigail rode Wind Dancer with a steady rhythm, her eyes sweeping the horizon, her heart carrying the weight of the mission entrusted to her. Takakota rode close, his presence silent but steadfast, his painted pony moving with the ease of a creature born to the prairie. 2 other warriors flanked them at a distance, keeping the illusion that she travelled with only a single guide. The deception was necessary, though Abigail's spirit wished the world could simply accept what lay between them without shadow or disguise. The morning sun painted the grasses in hues of gold, wildflowers bending gently in the wind, and yet beneath the beauty she saw reminders of the violence that had shaped this land. Burned homesteads marked by blackened timbers, crude wooden crosses leaning in lonely fields, the abandoned wheels of wagons half buried in the earth, echoes of lives uprooted and dreams shattered. Every ruin whispered a warning. Peace here was fragile, and love more fragile still. Yet when she glanced at Takakota, at the quiet strength in his face, the warning softened. His nearness was a kind of healing, as though simply sharing the journey made the weight easier to bear. Along the trail, their conversations deepened, stitched together by the patience of translation and the unspoken language of shared silences. Takakota told her stories of his people, of sacred valleys where the spirits of ancestors still lingered, of winter camps filled with laughter and firelight, of hunts that were prayers as much as survival. He did not hide the pain, the loss of warriors to raids, the hunger of lean seasons, the betrayal of treaties signed and broken by men who never kept their word. His honesty did not darken her heart. Instead, it drew her closer to him, for she saw in his voice the same scars she carried in her own. Loss did not make him bitter, only deeper, as though his wounds had taught him to cherish what remained. She shared her own stories in return, her words sometimes trembling but steadying under his gaze. She spoke of Thomas, her late husband, who had dreamed of a farm bursting with life. She spoke of her children, tiny graves beneath the cottonwoods, and the nights when grief had hollowed her soul until only silence remained. Takakota did not look away, did not fill the quiet with empty comfort. He listened with reverence, his eyes holding her pain without judgment, as though her memories were treasures he would guard as carefully as his own. In his listening, Abigail felt the first true easing of her sorrow, as if grief, when shared, became less of a burden and more of a thread binding hearts together. By the second evening, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley where Harmony Falls had been built. From afar, the town looked peaceful. Cabins scattered like seeds across the land, smoke curling from chimneys, children's laughter faint on the wind. Yet closer inspection revealed tension. Fences cut across old trails, livestock roamed where Comanche camps had once stood, and the settlers' eyes carried suspicion toward strangers. Abigail and Takakota entered as travelers seeking supplies, concealing the true nature of their mission. She felt every gaze heavy upon them, some curious, some openly hostile. His presence beside her drew whispers, though no one dared act openly against them. It did not take long before a crisis erupted that revealed the fragile state of the town. A fire broke out in the general store, leaping quickly to nearby buildings, threatening to consume half the settlement. Shouts filled the air, men and women scrambling with buckets, children crying in fear. Without hesitation, Abigail leapt from her horse and joined the line, her hands raw from passing water, her lungs seared by smoke. Takakota followed, though his presence drew wary glances from the settlers who had been raised to see his kind as enemies. Yet when they saw him lifting beams, carrying water with tireless strength, some of their suspicion faltered. Hours later, when the flames had finally been subdued, the town stood exhausted but intact. Abigail's face was streaked with soot, her arms trembling with fatigue, yet she felt a quiet pride. For a few hours at least, divisions had been forgotten, replaced by the shared struggle of saving homes. Jeremiah Blackwood, the leader of the settlement, approached her with gratitude, his voice heavy with both relief and suspicion. She gave only her name, speaking humbly, concealing the truth of her mission. Yet, as he spoke of Comanche raids, of fear and uncertainty, she realized how close the valley was to spilling into blood. That night, as she sat in the half-built church where she and Takakota were given a place to rest, she listened to the settlers' voices around the fire. Some spoke of hope, of the new lives they wished to build. Others, young and angry, spoke of war, of driving the Comanche from the valley forever. Their words carried both ignorance and fear, yet Abigail heard beneath them the desperation of people who had gambled everything on land they believed theirs. Her heart ached with the complexity of it. Two peoples bound by sorrow, each believing survival demanded the suffering of the other. Later, when most had slept, she found herself alone with Jeremiah Blackwood. In hushed tones, she spoke cautiously of peace, hinting that not all Comanche sought violence, that there might be a way to coexist. He looked at her with disbelief, suspicion flickering in his eyes, yet she pressed gently, speaking from the heart. "Most wars," she told him softly, "are born not of hatred, but of misunderstanding. If you knew them as I do, you would see not savages, but fathers, mothers, children, hearts that love and fear just as yours do." For a long moment he studied her, and she thought she saw doubt crack his certainty, but others had overheard fragments of her words. By morning, mistrust had hardened among some of the settlers. Marcus, Jeremiah's son, was especially venomous, his voice sharp with anger as he accused her of treachery. His suspicions spilled into action. She and Takakota were seized, bound with ropes, accused of spying for the Comanche. Abigail's protests fell on deaf ears, her pleas met with cold stares. For the first time since the river, she felt true terror, not for herself, but for what her capture might unleash. If word reached Iron Bear that his son and the woman who had saved him were prisoners, war would come crashing down upon the valley. Yet even in the moment of despair, her spirit reached for healing. She looked at Takakota, bound beside her, his face calm, though his eyes burned with restrained fury. She whispered his name, and in that single word passed courage between them, courage enough to endure. She reminded herself that love was not fragile, not truly. It endured even in chains, even in fire. And she prayed that the bond they had formed, the bridge they had begun to build, would hold against the storm rushing toward them. As the sun rose, painting the settlement in pale gold, riders appeared on the horizon. Comanche warriors, painted for war, moving swift as a storm. Abigail's breath caught. The world had reached its breaking point. The valley trembled between peace and bloodshed, and she, caught in the heart of it, understood that everything she loved, her home, her fragile healing, her bond with Takakota, would be tested in the hours to come. And still, even as fear pressed sharp against her chest, she held to the warmth of his gaze, to the unspoken vow they shared. For in love there was healing, and in healing there was strength, enough perhaps to guide them through the fire into the next chapter of their destiny. The valley was wrapped in silence so tense it seemed even the wind refused to breathe. Abigail stood bound in the center of Harmony Falls, her wrists raw from rope, her heart pounding in a rhythm that echoed the war drums she knew would soon thunder across the plains. Around her, settlers scrambled into defensive positions, their rifles clutched with hands more accustomed to plows and hammers than to weapons. Fear painted every face, anger burned in others, and she could feel how close they were to igniting a fire that could not be extinguished. Beside her, Takakota stood tall, his shoulders unyielding though his bonds cut into his flesh. His silence was not resignation, but control, the stillness of a man who carried storm within but knew when to unleash it. Abigail drew strength from his composure, finding in his presence a kind of healing even amid fear. Their eyes met briefly, and she felt the warmth of his gaze flow into her, steadying her trembling spirit. Even bound, even threatened, they were not alone. That bond, unspoken yet fierce, was a shield stronger than any rifle. The settlers' leader, Jeremiah Blackwood, wore a face of anguish, torn between the hope Abigail had planted in his heart and the rage his son Marcus stoked among the younger men. Marcus, burning with youthful arrogance, paraded Abigail and Takakota before the townsfolk as proof of treachery. He shouted that they were spies, that they had come to lure the Comanche into ambush. His words stung, not because they were true, but because they fell upon ears already primed by fear. Abigail longed to speak, to pierce the fog of ignorance with truth, yet the ropes and the fury of the crowd silenced her. The first war cries broke the air like lightning splitting the sky. From the hills surrounding Harmony Falls, the Comanche appeared. Warriors painted for battle, their horses moving as one body, their lances gleaming in the sun. Abigail's breath caught, her heart torn in two. She saw not invaders, but fathers and sons, brothers and husbands, men whose blood was tied to Takakota and whose trust had been placed in her. She also saw the settlers, frightened families huddled in their cabins, women clutching children, men clenching weapons they barely knew how to use. Two worlds, each desperate to survive, stood poised to destroy one another. Chief Iron Bear rode at the head, his stallion black as midnight, his war bonnet fierce with eagle feathers. His face was carved in fury, yet even from a distance Abigail recognized the depth of his pain. His son was bound before him, his honor insulted, his trust betrayed. When he halted his warriors and raised his hand, the plain fell silent, but for the restless stamping of horses. His voice carried across the distance, deep and clear, demanding the release of Takakota and the woman called Saves the Drowning. Marcus answered with defiance, dragging Abigail forward as a shield, shouting that any step closer would bring her death. The crowd of settlers roared their approval, though Abigail saw the doubt flickering in their eyes. Fear made them reckless, but fear also made them fragile. She turned her gaze to Jeremiah, pleading silently, and saw his torment. He had the power to stop his son, yet blood bound him, pride bound him, and fear of losing his people's trust shackled him. The moment teetered on the edge of chaos. Rifles aimed, bows strung, children cried, warriors growled low like thunder preparing to break. Abigail felt the weight of destiny press upon her shoulders. She had been named a bridge, and now the bridge would either hold or collapse into blood. Drawing upon every ounce of courage, she lifted her voice. Though her wrists were bound, her words carried like wind through the valley, steady and unwavering. She spoke not as a prisoner, but as a woman who had seen the humanity of both peoples. "You call me traitor," she said, her voice rising over the shouts. "But I have fought fires beside you, carried water to save your homes, shared the sweat of your struggle. And you, Chief Iron Bear, you know I risked my life to save your son, not for power or for gain, but because no life is less precious than another. Must the river that joined us now be drowned in blood?" The valley stilled. Even Marcus faltered, his hand trembling on his rifle. Jeremiah's face crumpled as though her words pierced the veil of his doubt. Chief Iron Bear's eyes locked on hers, sharp as flint, yet softened by memory, the memory of her standing in the river, of her voice steady as she saved Takakota. For a moment she felt hope flicker, fragile but alive. Then the settlers' women moved, led by Emma Blackwood, Jeremiah's wife. They stepped forward, shielding Abigail and Takakota with their bodies, their voices trembling but resolute. "We will not be part of this madness," Emma declared. "This woman saved us when fire threatened our homes. She saved our children. We will not see her destroyed for your fear." Other women joined, mothers clutching babies, daughters standing tall, their presence a wall no rifle could pierce without shame. The power shifted in that instant. Marcus's bluster faltered, his rage colliding with the undeniable truth that his own mother stood against him. The settlers' voices wavered, suspicion breaking beneath the weight of courage and compassion. On the ridge, the Comanche warriors held their breath, waiting for their chief's signal, their loyalty ready to turn fury into fire. Abigail's heart pounded as she looked between the two worlds, her voice once more steady, though her body shook. "Let us end this not with death, but with honor. Release us, and let there be words instead of blood. The earth has drunk enough sorrow." Her plea hung in the air, fragile as a prayer. For a heartbeat, the valley held its breath. Then Jeremiah stepped forward, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Release them," he commanded. His hand struck down his son's defiance, and men who had once shouted for violence lowered their rifles. The ropes fell from Abigail's wrists, the sting of freedom mingling with the warmth of Takakota's steady hand at her side. Chief Iron Bear did not order his warriors to charge. Instead, he advanced slowly, his eyes searching Abigail's face, his sons, the settlers. His voice thundered once more, not with rage, but with a stern warning. "This valley is sacred. It can be home to both peoples if honor is kept, but betray this trust again, and mercy will not come twice." And so, in that moment, the war that had threatened to consume Harmony Falls was stayed, not by weapons, but by voices, by compassion, by the fragile yet fierce courage of one woman who refused to let fear decide the fate of two nations. Abigail stood at the center of it, Takakota's hand brushing against hers, their bond stronger than any rope, their love unspoken yet undeniable. Healing, fragile and luminous, seeped into the soil of the valley like water finding root. As the sun sank behind the ridge, the first fragile threads of peace were woven. Yet Abigail knew this was only the beginning. Trust could fray, fear could return, and shadows still lingered beyond the horizon. But as she looked into Takakota's eyes, filled with warmth and promise, she felt certain that love would guide her into whatever came next. For love, like the river, flowed unceasing, carving paths even through stone, carrying both her heart and his into the next chapter of their entwined destiny. The days that followed were like living within a fragile dream, a balance so delicate that even a single harsh word might have shattered it. Harmony Falls, once trembling on the edge of ruin, now breathed with a tentative calm. Comanche warriors and white settlers eyed one another warily across the valley, yet their hands no longer clutched weapons with blind fury. Abigail felt the shift deep within her chest, the faint but undeniable rhythm of healing, as though the land itself sighed with relief that the ground had not been stained with more blood. She walked among the cabins of the settlement, her presence watched closely, yet not with the same suspicion as before. Some settlers nodded to her with cautious respect. Others offered small smiles of gratitude, remembering how she had labored beside them against fire. The women especially came to her, speaking softly of children, of the fragility of life on this hard frontier, their voices threaded with recognition that despite differences, their fears and hopes were the same. When Emma Blackwood pressed her hands warmly around Abigail's, it was as though two worlds touched and discovered they shared the same pulse. Yet Abigail's heart was not bound only to Harmony Falls. It was bound more fiercely still to the campfires glowing beyond the ridges, to the people who had named her Saves the Drowning. Each evening she rode to their circle, the Comanche guards greeting her as kin, Takakota always near, his smile lighting her weariness as surely as a flame brightens darkness. Among his people she was no longer a stranger, but a presence woven carefully into their stories. Children followed her with laughter, elders watched her with curiosity, and though suspicion had not vanished, it had softened enough for trust to take root. With Takakota, the bond deepened with every shared glance, every moment carved quietly out of duty's weight. They spoke in fragments of each other's language, piecing together meaning from broken words and gestures, and in those fragments Abigail discovered a beauty greater than fluency, the language of patience, of care, of eyes that linger too long to be explained away. She saw how he carried his people's burdens, shouldering expectations heavy enough to bend most men, yet he carried them with quiet dignity. He saw how she carried her grief, transformed now into strength that refused to falter. In each other's wounds they discovered mirrors, and in those mirrors healing became love. One evening, beneath a sky swept with stars so sharp they seemed alive, Takakota led her to the river where their story had begun. The quicksand pool had hardened now, its surface deceptive, but no longer deadly. He touched the turquoise pendant at her chest, then placed his own hand against his heart. "Life," he said in halting English, "is not gift we keep. It is gift we share. You gave me mine. I give you mine." The words were simple, yet they pierced Abigail with a tenderness that left her trembling. She reached for his hand, and when their fingers entwined, it was as though the night itself bowed to their union. But love on the frontier was never safe, never sheltered. The fragile peace demanded constant tending. Disputes flared over livestock, over land, over fear that would not die easily. Abigail became the voice that wove between, carrying messages, soothing tempers, speaking with the authority not of power, but of compassion. There were times when she felt nearly broken, when voices rose in anger and mistrust clawed at every word. Yet in those moments, Takakota was her anchor. He would ride with her into the settlement, or wait by the river when she returned, his presence steady, his gaze telling her she was not alone. Together they stood as proof that love could be both shield and bridge. Seasons shifted, the valley turning from green abundance to the harsh winds of winter. Abigail's cabin became not only her home, but a gathering place where settlers and Comanche sat together around a common fire, sharing food, sharing silence, sharing fragments of hope. She often caught herself pausing, watching them with quiet wonder, the flames painting their faces in gold, the very people who had once been sworn enemies now listening to one another's stories. In those moments, she knew her choice had been right, no matter how heavy the burden. Her love for Takakota did not bloom with sudden declarations or stolen kisses, but with the constancy of presence, the way he sought her first in a crowd, the way his hand brushed hers when no one watched, the way his voice softened when speaking her name. Their love was not the reckless fire of youth, but the steady flame of two souls who had walked through grief and chosen healing. When she lay awake at night, the turquoise pendant warm against her skin, she no longer felt the hollow ache of loss. She felt instead the quiet fullness of being known, of being cherished, of being alive in a way she had once thought impossible. Still, Abigail knew the road ahead would never be free of shadows. Some settlers resented the peace, longing for conquest. Some warriors doubted her role, fearing it weakened their strength. But she also knew that love is strongest not when life is easy, but when storms rage. She and Takakota had faced the river, the quicksand, the threat of war, and still they stood. Each trial was another knot binding them together, each sorrow another reason to hold tighter. And so, even as the horizon whispered of trials yet to come, she chose to believe in the healing that their love carried. On a late winter's night, as snow drifted softly across the plains, Abigail sat with Takakota by the fire. He spoke of dreams, of children who might grow in both languages, of land where both peoples might walk without fear, of peace that could last beyond their lifetimes. She listened, her head resting against his shoulder, her heart warmed by the fire and by the hope in his voice. It was then she realized that love, when true, is not merely the joining of two souls, it is the seed of change, planted in the soil of the world, destined to bloom even when storms try to tear it apart. The journey had begun with quicksand and fear, but it had blossomed into tenderness and courage. Abigail knew that one day their story would be told not as tragedy, but as proof that even in the harshest lands, love can grow like wildflowers between stones. The turquoise bear against her chest glowed faintly in the firelight, and she touched it with reverence, whispering silently to the spirits of her lost husband and children that she had found healing not by forgetting them, but by carrying their memory into this new love. Her heart, once hollow, now beat with fullness. Her solitude had given way to companionship, her sorrow to strength, her fear to a love that belonged not only to her and Takakota, but to the two peoples who now looked to them as living proof that bridges could be built. The story was not finished, nor would it ever be. Love such as theirs is not an ending, but a path. If this story touched something within you, let your voice join ours. Share your thoughts in the comments, let your heart speak, and if you believe in love's power to heal even the deepest divides, leave a like to let it be known. Subscribe to follow the journey further, for every voice, every presence, helps keep the flame alive. This is not only Abigail and Takakota's story. It is also a reminder that love belongs to us all, waiting to be carried forward one heart to another, one story to the next.